Richard III is perhaps one of the most controversial monarchs in the entire history of English kings and queens. Traditionally, he's been cast as a villain. After all, didn't he steal the throne from a child? His older brother's son, who he subsequently had killed, or potentially even murdered himself. That's why in a previous video we did this. But maybe things aren't as simple as all that. Is it possible he was actually a good king who was himself illegally overthrown? Someone whose name and reputation was dragged through the mud by history's victors, the Tudors. In this video, we'll take a closer look. First though, let's take a look at his life and reign. Richard III was King of England for just over 2 years, from 1483 to 1485. He's the very last of the 14 Plantagenet kings that ruled between 1154, when William the Conqueror's great-grandson Henry II came to power, and 1485, when the subject of this video died. 331 years in total. After the accession of Henry VI, the Plantagenets split into two factions, the House of Lancaster and the House of York. Richard III belonged to the latter. He's here in our timeline, ruling almost 550 years ago. Richard III was born in 1452. 30 years into the reign of Henry VI, who his older brother Edward would overthrow in 1461, before being crowned king. He was the youngest surviving child of Richard III, Duke of York, who at the time of his birth was Lieutenant of Ireland. Richard III's early story is the story of his father and his role in the Wars of the Roses. You can learn more about that in previous videos, but in a nutshell, around 60 years prior to Richard III's reign, King Henry V had beaten the French into submission and had conquered most of France. Around 30 years after that, though, his son, Henry VI, had lost most of it. These losses culminated with the fall of Gascony in 1453. Well, Gascony had been in English possession since the mid-1100s, and had remained in the hands of 10 previous Plantagenet kings. Some of the worst kings in history, including John, Henry III, Edward II, and Richard II, had all come and gone, yet none of them had been so bad that they had lost the jewel in England's French possessions. Not so for Henry VI. The news of the loss of Gascony was such a shock, the king had a mental breakdown. He was so ill he was unable to feed himself, and he couldn't even recognise his newborn son. England was headless. Richard III's father, the Duke of York, stepped forward. Desperate for a strong leader, the English nobles welcomed him with open arms. Only when Henry VI finally recovered, he dismissed the Duke and restored all of his unpopular advisors. In 1455, the Duke decided that only force could separate these advisors from the king. He raised an army and defeated the king's forces at St. Albans. The battle marked the start of the Wars of the Roses. We'll not go into much more detail here. This is a video about Richard III, who at this point was still just an infant. In summary though, several years passed, and when Richard III was around 8 years old, his father was killed by Lancastrian forces at the Battle of Wakefield. That could have been the end of the Wars of the Roses. Instead, Richard's brother Edward, who was 10 years older than him, stepped up, defeated the Lancastrians at the Battle of Towton in 1461, overthrew Henry VI, and had himself crowned. Edward IV, as he was styled, proved to be a generous older brother. He made Richard the Duke of Gloucester and paid for his education. Richard spent much of his childhood and teenage years in Middleham Castle in Yorkshire, where he trained as a knight. In 1470, when Richard was around 18, his brother Edward IV was overthrown by the Earl of Warwick's forces. Warwick placed Henry VI back on the throne for around 6 months. The two brothers, Richard and Edward IV, fled England and hid out in The Hague. They soon made their way back to England via Yorkshire and defeated Warwick's forces at the battles of Barnet and Tewkesbury. Richard distinguished himself as a military leader, successfully commanding the Yorkist vanguard and ultimately helping to put his brother back on the throne. In 1472, aged 19, Richard married Anne Neville. She was the widow of Henry VI's son, Prince Edward, and one of the daughters of the defeated Earl of Warwick. Confusingly, she was also Richard's cousin, once removed. After that, he was given a great deal of power in the north of England and became the most powerful magnate there, effectively Lord of the North, ruling there on his brother's behalf. His early training as a knight proved useful when in 1481 he led an invasion of Scotland, recaptured Berwick and occupied Edinburgh. He was rewarded with the whole of Cumberland. If he'd entertained ever becoming king at this point, it would have been in the realms of fantasy, wouldn't it? But in 1483, events took an unexpected turn when his older brother, King Edward IV, died suddenly. 3 months later, Richard would be king. We explored how this happened in our previous video on Edward V, so please watch it if you're interested. Briefly though, Edward IV's son was naturally appointed king, but as he was still a 12-year-old boy, his uncle Richard decided to take charge of matters. The new boy king was separated from the adults who had looked after him and placed in the Tower of London for his own safety, alongside his younger brother. A grand coronation was planned, but Richard made sure it was delayed twice. Then, out of nowhere, it was suddenly declared that his father, Edward IV, had been married to Edward V's mother bigamously. The result was that Edward was illegitimate, and so he couldn't be crowned. Instead, Richard stepped forward and took the throne, declaring himself King Richard III. Strangely, within months, the two boys, Edward V and his brother, had gone missing. They were never seen again and were very soon presumed murdered. We'll circle back to these events briefly at the end. But for now, the newly crowned Richard III faced the almost constant threat of being overthrown himself. There were several reasons for this. Firstly, the previous century had seen no less than 3 Plantagenet kings overthrown. Richard II was overthrown by Henry IV, Henry VI was overthrown by Edward IV, and Edward IV himself had been briefly overthrown by Henry VI. Overthrowing a sitting king had become, well, not exactly a habit, but not the most shocking thing that could happen. But Richard was also unpopular with many of his subjects. Yes, there were those who accepted the backstory of Edward V being illegitimate, allowing Richard III to ascend to the throne. But, shock horror, many others viewed Richard himself as an illegitimate usurper. This may partly be because he'd made lots of enemies among southern nobles, by replacing them with loyal barons from his stomping grounds in the north of England. Finally, though, his position had been severely weakened by the death of his only son Edward, and the following year the death of his wife the Queen, leaving Richard without an heir and without the prospect of replacing his lost son. Besides all this, across the Channel a plan was being hatched to get fresh blood on the English throne, that of Henry Tudor. Tudor had at best a tenuous claim to the throne. The mighty King Henry V had died in 1422, leaving his Queen Catherine of Valois widowed. 6 years later, when her young son Henry VI was on the throne, she got married again, this time to a Welsh noble, Owen Tudor, and they had 2 sons together, Edmund and Jasper, who were welcomed into the royal circle as the king's half-brothers. In the 1450s, Edmund Tudor and his wife produced Henry Tudor, King Henry VII, as he would later be styled. So effectively, Tudor's father was the king's half-brother, making him a kind of half-nephew to a sitting king. Henry's claim may have been tenuous, but the Wars of the Roses had split England down the centre. Edward IV, Edward V and Richard III were all Yorkist kings. In contrast, Henry Tudor was from the Lancastrian line. Kind of. Given there was no one else, though, he was perhaps the last potential shot the Lancastrians had to get someone from their side back on the throne. It didn't matter if his claim was tenuous. Henry was their man, and that was that. Even at the time of Richard's coronation, there was a scheme afoot to get Henry Tudor on the English throne. In 1483, there was a Lancastrian rebellion in the south of England. Richard suppressed it, and the rebels fled to Brittany, declaring Henry Tudor as the true king. Over the course of the next year and a half, these rebels plotted and made their plans, spurred on, of course, by England's forever enemies, France and Scotland. Finally, in 1485, Henry Tudor and his Lancastrian supporters invaded England and faced down Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth. Richard, a skilled military leader, should have easily routed the invading army. Instead, fate stepped in. As he charged the enemy on horseback, the king was surrounded and hacked to death. Richard III's reign was over. His story, however, wasn't. As the various reigns of Tudor kings progressed, Richard III was painted as an out-and-out villain who had only been king because of his treachery. It was even written into England's cultural fabric thanks to William Shakespeare, who penned his play about the king just over a century later. Henry Tudor was declared king on the same day Richard fell. We'll cover Henry VII in our next video. But for now, let's circle back to the matter of Richard III's role in the disappearance of his nephews. The big question is, did he do it? Did he commit a grave act of evil, snatching his 12-year-old nephew's birthright from him before having him murdered? On the face of it, the events following Edward IV's death do seem quite strange. His young son is declared the rightful heir, but as he makes his way to London for his coronation, he's intercepted by his uncle Richard. Richard places him in the Tower of London for his own protection. Then, Edward is suddenly declared illegitimate and disappears, presumed murdered. And if we ask here, cui bono, who benefits? Well, on the face of it, Richard does. He gets to become king. It seems pretty obvious Richard III is guilty of this heinous crime. But like all good murder mysteries, there is another side to this story, which could mean that Richard is innocent. You see, one of the main reasons we know Richard III is guilty is because, well, the winners, the Tudors, told us he was. Should we just take them at their word? It's not like they have anything to gain, right? As mentioned above, Henry Tudor's claim to the throne was pretty tenuous. One way to help legitimise his claim, of course, would be to delegitimise the bloke he'd just dethroned, perhaps by hacking away at his character. Richard's body went missing after the Battle of Bosworth. It was found 527 years later in 2012. Scientific analysis showed that he suffered from a curvature of the spine. Tudor propaganda would use this to cast him as the guilty party. His mind was as twisted as his body, they said. Even William Shakespeare got in on the act and portrayed him as deformed and evil. In the ignorant and superstitious days of Tudor England, a deformity may well have told you all you needed to know about someone's character, but now, of course, we know Richard III's disability had nothing whatsoever to do with his actions. If anything, knowing he must have suffered greatly from this condition makes his achievement as a fearless military leader all that more impressive. In fact, we also know from the records that Richard III had a kind streak. When he was the Duke of Gloucester, there are numerous reports of poor people approaching him and achieving justice with his help. And in 1484, during his only parliament as king, he tried to introduce some genuinely good laws, giving everyone, not just the rich, access to bail, introducing reforms to prevent juries being bribed, and other changes to stop people being ripped off by dodgy landlords. He's kind of like a medieval A-team and littlest hobo rolled into one. Does it seem feasible that someone who sought justice for the poor would act so wickedly towards his helpless nephews? Richard's actions in moving Edward V and his brother to the Tower of London seemed suspicious when presented without context. But the fact is that Edward V really did need to be protected. The Wars of the Roses were still very fresh in everyone's minds, and, as mentioned, soon after Edward IV's death, the previously defeated Lancastrian nobles were already plotting to get their side, in the form of Henry Tudor, back on the throne. England had previously placed a child on the throne in the 1420s in the form of Henry VI, and that had ended in absolute chaos with the Wars of the Roses. Could the country really risk that again? What the realm needed was a strong leader, a military man, a good knight who could lead, perhaps in the moulds of previous warrior kings, Richard I and Henry V, essentially a hard man who could bring peace to the nation. It's possible that Richard III was felt to be England's best protection at the time against more chaos. What of the story about Edward V suddenly being declared illegitimate, conveniently clearing the way for Richard to take the throne? Well, the fact is, it's possible he was illegitimate. His father, King Edward IV, was a womanizer, and in the early days of his reign, he'd already been found out to have been secretly married. Is it beyond the realms of fantasy to imagine that the wife Edward IV had officially declared as his queen, Edward's mother Elizabeth of Woodville, wasn't actually the king's first wife at all? It's not impossible. And even if this wasn't true, and if the Yorkists led by Richard III were looking for a good reason to swap a child for a warrior, this was a pretty good reason. Is it possible that this was simply a story they'd concocted amongst themselves? There was even a rumour later put about that rather than being murdered, the princes in the tower were whisked away for their own safety and given new identities. Could this be true? Ultimately, we'll probably never know the truth. Richard III remains a historical character shrouded in mystery. What do you think? Was Richard a bad egg, or a good man whose reputation was trashed by his victorious enemies? Let us know in the comments. Next time, we'll cover the life of his successor, a man who founded a dynasty, the father of King Henry VIII. I am, of course, talking about Henry Tudor, better known as Henry VII.